Jimmy Fallon has hosted thousands of guests over 11 years, but none of them stood up mid-interview and walked into the audience, until Jake Connelly saw that woman. The Tonight Show. Studio 6A at Rockefeller Center. Thursday night. Another packed house. Another celebrity interview. Another round of games and laughter and viral moments that would dominate social media by morning. Jake Connelly was the guest. Hollywood's current golden boy, the action star whose latest film had just crossed $500 million at the box office. Charming, quick-witted, the kind of guest who made Jimmy's job easy. They'd been laughing through stories about the film's stunts, trading jokes, the audience eating up every moment. Perfect television. Smooth. Professional. Exactly what America expected at 11:35 p.m. on a Thursday. Until Jake's eyes drifted past Jimmy, scanning the audience during a moment when Jimmy was setting up his next question. Until those eyes locked onto someone in the third row. Until everything stopped. Jake's smile vanished. His entire body went rigid. The laugh that had been building in his throat died instantly. Jimmy was mid-sentence. "So when you had to jump from that helicopter, did they actually—" "Wait," Jake interrupted, his voice suddenly different. Flat. Shocked. "Wait. Hold on." Jimmy stopped, confused. "What?" Jake didn't answer. He was staring at the audience now, his hands slowly rising to point. The cameras scrambled to follow his line of sight, operators frantically adjusting angles, trying to figure out what had grabbed Hollywood's biggest star's attention. "That woman," Jake said, his voice barely audible through his microphone. "Third row. Gray hair. That woman right there." 300 audience members turned in their seats, following Jake's pointing finger. Cameras zoomed in on the third row where an elegant woman in her 60s sat frozen, both hands pressed to her chest, her face a mask of shock. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted into chaos. Director Gary Pastor was shouting into his headset. "What's happening? Did someone get hurt? Camera 2, stay on Jake. Camera 3, find that woman. What the hell is going on?" On stage, Jimmy set down his blue cue cards, his usual quick thinking momentarily failing him. "Jake? Buddy? You okay?" Jake stood up. Not a casual standing, sudden urgent, like he'd been shocked. The guest chair scraped backward across the stage with an audible screech. Questlove's drumsticks paused mid-beat. The Roots went silent. The audience held its collective breath. "I'm sorry," Jake said, but he wasn't looking at Jimmy. He was looking at the woman. "I'm sorry, I have to." He stepped off the platform. Just walked right off the raised stage area where guests sit, his dress shoes hitting the studio floor with a sharp click. Then he was moving through the narrow space between the stage and the front row of audience seating, heading straight toward the woman in the third row. Jimmy stood up behind his desk, genuinely alarmed now. "Jake? What's happening?" The cameras stayed locked on Jake as he reached the third row. The woman hadn't moved. She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, her hands still pressed to her chest like she was trying to hold her heart inside her body. Jake stopped directly in front of her, blocking the aisle, and his voice, picked up perfectly by the boom microphones overhead, cracked when he spoke. "Mom?" The word hung in the studio like smoke. The woman's face crumpled. "Jacob," she whispered back. "And Jake Connelly." Action star, household name, man whose face was on billboards across the country, dropped to his knees in the aisle of The Tonight Show and started sobbing. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 23 years ago. Jake Connelly wasn't always Jake Connelly, movie star. 23 years ago, he was Jacob Miller, a 15-year-old kid living in Cleveland with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. His mother's name was Catherine Miller. She was a nurse at Cleveland Clinic during the day, worked the evening shift at a diner 4 nights a week, and cleaned office buildings on weekends. She did it all without complaint, without asking anyone for help, determined to give her son a better life than she'd had. Jake remembered coming home from school to an empty apartment most days. His mother would leave notes on the kitchen counter, instructions for heating up dinner, reminders about homework, little messages of encouragement. "You're going to do great things, Jacob. I believe in you. Love, Mom." He was in drama club at school. His teacher, Mr. Harrison, said he had real talent, that he should consider acting seriously. But acting meant classes they couldn't afford, auditions in New York or Los Angeles they had no way to get to, dreams that seemed impossible when they were struggling to pay rent. When Jake was 16, his mother got sick. It started as fatigue. She dismissed it as exhaustion from working too much. Then came the pain. The weight loss. Finally, the diagnosis that changed everything: stage 3 ovarian cancer. Catherine Miller couldn't afford to get sick. She had no health insurance that would cover the treatment she needed. The hospital bills started piling up immediately, tens of thousands of dollars for surgeries, chemotherapy, medications. She kept working, even when she could barely stand. Even when the chemo made her so sick she'd spend her breaks in the restaurant bathroom throwing up. She kept going because stopping meant losing their apartment, meant Jake would have nowhere to live. Jake watched his mother disappear. Not die, not yet, but vanish into exhaustion and pain and the crushing weight of medical debt. He was 17 by then, old enough to understand how desperate things had become, old enough to feel completely helpless. One night, he came home from school to find his mother sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by bills, crying silently. She didn't even hear him come in. He'd never seen her cry before. Not once in his entire life. "Mom?" She looked up, quickly wiping her eyes, forcing a smile. "Hey, baby. I didn't hear you come home. How was school?" "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing. Just tired." "Those are bills," Jake said, looking at the papers spread across the table. "Medical bills." "Don't worry about it. I'll figure it out." But Jake could see the numbers. Even at 17, he could do the math. They owed over $200,000. His mother made maybe $30,000 a year when you added up all 3 jobs. There was no figuring it out. 2 weeks later, Jake did something he would regret for the rest of his life. He ran away. Not because he didn't love his mother. Because he did. Because watching her work herself to death trying to save him from their situation was killing him. Because he was 17 and terrified and convinced that if he left, if she only had herself to worry about, maybe she could survive. He left a note. "Mom, I love you. I'm sorry. I'm going to make something of myself, and then I'm coming back to fix everything. Please get better. Please don't hate me. Love, Jacob." He took a bus to New York with $300 he'd saved from a part-time job at a grocery store. He stayed in homeless shelters. He auditioned for anything he could find. He lied about his age, used a fake last name, Connelly instead of Miller, so his mother couldn't track him down and drag him home. It took 6 years. 6 years of struggle, of tiny roles, of nearly giving up 100 times. But Jake Connelly, the name he'd invented to hide from his past, slowly built a career. Small parts became bigger parts. Bigger parts became leading roles. By the time he was 27, he was a legitimate star. And he never went back to Cleveland. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. He told himself he would. Once he'd made it. Once he had enough money to pay off all those medical bills. Once he could face his mother and prove he hadn't abandoned her for nothing. But the years kept passing. His career kept growing. And the shame of what he'd done, of leaving her when she was dying, of disappearing without even a phone call, grew too large to overcome. He hired a private investigator when he was 30 to find out if his mother was even still alive. The investigator came back with an address in Newark, New Jersey. Catherine Miller had survived. She'd gone through bankruptcy. Lost their apartment. Moved to Newark for cheaper rent. She was still a nurse, working at a community hospital. The investigator reported that she'd asked about her son over the years. Filed a missing persons report that went nowhere. Eventually stopped asking. Jake got the address. Put it in his wallet. Told himself he'd go see her. Soon. When he was ready. When he'd figured out what to say. 8 more years passed. And then tonight, on a Thursday in November, Catherine Miller had won tickets to The Tonight Show through a radio contest. She'd never won anything in her life, but the radio station had called her name, and she'd screamed with joy like a teenager. She'd taken the train from Newark to Rockefeller Center, waited in line with the other audience members, and been randomly seated in the 3rd row. She'd been excited to see whoever the guests were. She didn't even know who was scheduled. And then Jake Connelly had walked onto the stage, and Catherine Miller's heart had stopped. She'd recognized him instantly. Not as Jake Connelly, action star. As Jacob. Her son. The boy who'd run away 23 years ago. The son she'd never stopped looking for. She'd sat frozen in her seat, unable to breathe, unable to process what she was seeing. Her Jacob. On television. Famous. Successful. Alive. And then, during the interview, Jake's eyes had swept across the audience and locked onto hers. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jake was still on his knees in the aisle, his hands gripping the armrests of his mother's seat, his forehead pressed against her lap while he sobbed. Catherine had her hands in his hair, still thick and dark like it had been when he was a boy, and was crying just as hard. The audience sat in complete silence. 300 strangers bearing witness to a reunion that was simultaneously beautiful and devastating. Jimmy stood beside his desk, his own eyes filled with tears. His producer was in his ear, asking what he wanted to do. Cut to commercial? Keep rolling? What was the protocol for a moment like this? Jimmy pulled out his earpiece and let it dangle. He walked around his desk, stepped off the stage the same way Jake had, and approached the 3rd row. He crouched down beside Jake and put a hand on his shoulder. "Hey," Jimmy said softly. "You want to tell me what's happening?" Jake lifted his head. His face was destroyed. Red, tear-streaked, barely able to breathe. "This is my mom. I haven't seen her in 23 years. I left her. I ran away when she was sick and I never went back." Catherine was shaking her head, her hands cupping Jake's face. "You're here now. You're alive. That's all that matters. I'm so sorry," Jake choked out. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I thought if I left, you could focus on getting better. I thought I could make something of myself and come back and fix everything. But I was just a scared kid and I was wrong. I was so wrong." Catherine pulled him close. "You were trying to save me. I know that. I've always known that." Jimmy looked at the camera, then back at Jake and Catherine. He made a decision. "We're taking a break," Jimmy announced. "A long one. And when we come back, if Jake and his mom want to, we're going to hear this story properly." The audience erupted in applause. Jimmy helped Jake to his feet, helped Catherine stand, and walked them both backstage to a private room. They sat there for 40 minutes. Mother and son. 23 years of silence becoming words. Jimmy arranged for the show to continue without Jake's segment. Some things mattered more than television. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Before Jake left that night, Jimmy gave him something. His own Tonight Show name card, the one that sat on his desk every night. "Keep this," Jimmy said. "Remember the night you stopped running." Jake carries it in his wallet. Next to his mother's address in Newark, the address he finally visited the morning after the show. Catherine Miller moved to Los Angeles 6 months later. She lives 10 minutes from her son. They have dinner every Sunday. And every Sunday, Jake thanks her for never giving up on him.